Oh, honey, pull up a chair. I have to tell you about what happened next. You remember Richard Ashford, right? The big, scary billionaire who made that wild, crazy bet 6 months ago? Well, let me tell you, things were good. For 6 whole months, it was like the sun finally broke through the famous London smog. Richard, the man who used to count his life in stock options and quarterly reports, was different. You wouldn't recognize him. He was still 55, still sharp as a tack, but that cold, polished shell he wore for decades, it was gone, replaced by something warm, something human. He found the redemption he was searching for, not in massive philanthropic foundations, but in the small, chaotic, beautiful reality of East London. Rosie's kitchen wasn't just saved. It was thriving. It became the very heart of the community. And standing right there at the center of this miracle was Elena Petrova. That girl, only 28, she had fire in her soul. Richard didn't just hire her. He made her the director of the Community First Initiative, CFI. She took that program and turned it into a powerhouse, proving that Richard's empire, Ashford Technologies, could actually do good while still making a profit. Elena had finally achieved the stability she fought so hard for. Her mother was better, the bills were paid, and her work was truly defending the vulnerable people she cared about most. Richard and Elena, they were a force. The cynics laughed, the corporate types whispered, but Richard didn't care. He finally felt that priceless contentment he'd chased his whole life. He was proving that you could build success based on human values, not just profit margins. It was a beautiful bubble, wasn't it? A shining tower of kindness rising right out of the grime of the city. But here is the thing about bubbles, darling. They always attract sharp edges. Richard's happiness, Elena's success, and the thriving community initiative they built, it all made a lot of powerful people very, very nervous. You see, when a billionaire starts caring more about people than percentages, the people who only care about money start to fight back. And while Rick was enjoying the quiet victory of his new life, his old life, the brutal, ruthless corporate world he swore he'd left behind, was circling like a hungry wolf. They were watching him, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Because in the heart of London's gleaming financial towers, there were men who believed that kindness was just a financial drain. And they were about to send Richard Ashford and Elena Petrova a chilling message. You cannot build a conscience on our ledger. Part 2. The Board Rebels 6 months. That's how long the corporate suits at Ashford Technologies endured the radical change. 6 months of prioritizing community impact over pure quarterly returns. The board of directors was furious. They saw Richard's newfound conscience not as a moral triumph, but as a liability. Every penny spent on the CFI, every hour Elena's team spent helping people, was viewed by these sharks as a direct theft from their pockets. The unrest, however, wasn't random. It was being carefully engineered, fed by someone who knew exactly where all the skeletons were buried in Ashford Technologies. Julian Cross, Richard's former partner, the man who burned with envy and felt Richard had stolen their foundational technology 2 decades prior, hadn't just vanished after being fired. He had been lurking in the deep shadows, meticulously constructing the perfect sabotage. Julian began feeding the board members precisely what they wanted to see. Inflated, falsified profit-loss reports painting the Community First Initiative as a colossal financial failure, a dead weight dragging the entire company down. He framed Richard as a reckless fool, sentimentalizing his way toward bankruptcy. The attack was sudden and brutal. Richard was blindsided during a routine executive meeting. A key member of the board stood up, visibly agitated, and called for a formal vote of no confidence. Not in Richard, not yet, but in Elena's entire division. The CFI, the director spat out, is an unsustainable financial hemorrhage. It must be liquidated immediately, and the funds reinvested into sectors that actually generate returns. Richard was forced to fight a political war he hadn't prepared for, spending hours in closed-door sessions, arguing for the moral value of Elena's work, knowing the directors only spoke the language of dollars and cents. Elena watched, terrified, as the empire that had given her security now threatened to crumble her life's work. She recognized the signs. The corporate ruthlessness Richard had shed was now being wielded against them. Richard worked non-stop for 3 days straight, trying to counter the engineered reports, but the damage was done. The seed of doubt, planted by Julian, had blossomed into panic among the shareholders. The final hammer blow arrived via internal memo late Thursday evening. A critical vote was scheduled for the following week, a vote that had been legally framed to ensure maximum damage. If passed, it would legally dismantle the Community First initiative, wiping out every single bit of Elena's work, closing projects across London, and erasing Richard's 6 months of legacy. The clock was ticking toward the Monday vote. Richard sat alone in his sterile office, looking out at the city lights. He knew this wasn't just corporate politics. This was personal, engineered. But before he could even begin to identify the source of the attack, another, more devastating memo landed on his desk. It was a formal notification, brief and cold, stating that due to the perceived instability and financial risk posed by the CFI, a third party was making a formal inquiry into the potential for a hostile takeover. Richard realized with sickening certainty that this board revolt wasn't the attack. It was just the opening shot. The formal notification of the takeover inquiry felt physically cold in Richard's hand, a thin sheet of paper conveying a mountainous threat. He recognized the signature of the lead investment bank, agents of the Phoenix Group. They weren't mere opportunists. They were predatory financial wolves, known for launching lethal, rapid strikes aimed not at integration, but at liquidation. Richard felt the blood rush from his head, leaving the air in the silent office thick and difficult to breathe. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes, trying to dispel the image of his father's collapse. The same predatory tactics, 20 years prior, now aimed at him. The board's dissent wasn't the attack. It was perfectly orchestrated camouflage. He reached for the phone and contacted Elena, who was barricaded in the operational archives, trying to manage the political fallout of the impending vote on the Community First Initiative, CFI. "It's Julian," Richard stated, the name tasting like ash. "He didn't just quit. He engineered this whole thing. The board revolt was just the distraction." Elena's voice, usually a steady anchor of analytical logic, was tight with urgency. "I know, Richard. I'm deep in the forensic audit. The Phoenix Group uses algorithmic efficiency studies to justify their hostile bids. They target highly capitalized firms with easily excisable, non-performing assets. Julian's reports on the CFI, the ones he submitted just before his departure, artificially inflate our overhead by 40% and minimize community returns by nearly 60%. Mathematically, the CFI is the first thing they will gut to justify the premium they're paying for the takeover." The sickening reality settled. Julian wasn't interested in a mere executive position. He wanted to watch Richard's foundation, the company and the redemption it represented, burn to the ground. Elena spent the next 6 hours in a frantic race against the clock, fueled by caffeine and a visceral fear of instability. She tracked Julian's digital footprints back through the company servers, past layers of routine executive data, until she located a hidden encrypted server archive, Julian's private vault. It was a digital lockbox, sealed tight, dating back to their college days. She felt a gnawing pressure behind her sternum, the physical manifestation of impending disaster. This wasn't about current quarterly reports. This was about history. This was about the true rot at the base of the tower. When the final firewall shattered, revealing the contents of the vault, Elena gasped, a choked, silent sound swallowed by the vast, empty server room. The file names weren't financial. They were obscure legal codes, cross-referenced with patents Richard acquired 20 years ago. The acquisition that founded Ashford Technologies. Elena opened the primary document. The text, dry and technical, accused Richard of illegal anti-competitive practices and proprietary fraud related to that initial cornerstone technology. It wasn't simply damning evidence of moral compromise. It was definitive proof of corporate criminality that had been successfully covered up. If the Phoenix Group used this data in their takeover bid, it wouldn't just cripple Ashford Technologies. It would obliterate Richard's reputation and expose him to severe criminal prosecution, leading to prison time. Julian had kept a nuclear option, waiting until Richard had the most to lose: his legacy, his freedom, and the community he was finally starting to serve. Elena's heart began to hammer against her ribs with the violence of a trapped bird. She gripped the cold, hard edge of the desk, forcing herself to maintain control, analyzing the chain of custody, ensuring the documents were legitimate. Julian had not merely sought revenge, he had ensured Richard's complete and utter systemic destruction. She knew she couldn't call Richard. Not with this. Not when he was preparing his corporate defense, believing the battle was confined to hostile bids and board votes. As she moved to securely download the evidence, a secondary, recent attachment in the file tree blinked, drawing her eye. It was an email chain between Julian and an outside lawyer, dated just 48 hours prior. The subject line was a specific, terrifying precision strike aimed at the very thing Richard held dearest: Rosie's Kitchen. Phase 1. Immediate condemnation. The accompanying documents detailed a spurious environmental hazard report, falsified and expedited by a corrupt city inspector. Julian wasn't just leveraging the company. He was leveraging Richard's moral vulnerability. The deadline stipulated in the court order was set for 48 hours, demanding immediate structural assessment and eventual demolition. Elena felt the blood draining from her extremities. The corporate takeover was the headshot, but this was the personal stake through the heart. Julian knew that Richard's commitment to Rosie's Kitchen was the deepest part of his fragile redemption. The screen flickered, displaying an update to the court order. The technical team was already en route, scheduled to secure the site and begin preparatory work for demolition within the hour. Elena slammed the laptop shut. She had the evidence that could save Richard from prison and expose Julian's systemic fraud. But the clock on Rosie's Kitchen had been silently moved forward. She had to get to East London now, to physically stop the cruise. But if she left, Richard would walk into the boardroom blind to the criminal conspiracy Julian had prepared. Richard, meanwhile, was receiving frantic updates about the board members he had been trying to persuade. His attention focused entirely on the morning's hostile bid defense strategy meeting, the meeting he absolutely had to attend to save the company. Elena stared at the locked laptop, the key to Richard's freedom within, and then at her phone, picturing the bulldozer heading toward Rosie's Kitchen. She realized with a terrifying jolt of adrenaline, Richard was about to be forced to choose between the integrity of his entire corporate empire and the small, vibrant community he had promised to protect, a choice that Julian had specifically designed to ensure he failed both ways. The digital clock on Elena's phone confirmed the impossible. The court order to condemn Rosie's Kitchen had been executed via an emergency injunction based on spurious yet legally binding environmental hazard reports. The language was cold, precise, and signed by a judge Julian Cross had clearly bribed or manipulated. The deadline was not the 48 hours Richard's legal team had anticipated, but within the hour. A demolition crew, already mobilized under the guise of an emergency remediation project, was descending upon East London. Elena gripped the edge of the desk, the polished granite suddenly feeling unstable beneath her fingers. The laptop containing Julian's encrypted files sat beside the phone, a symbol of potential future justice. But justice was useless if the physical heart of the Community First initiative was flattened into dust. No, she thought, her internal voice a sharp command, overriding the professional cautious part of her brain. Richard is fighting for the Empire. I have to fight for the people. She knew the history of these tactics. Julian Cross wasn't just attacking a foundation, he was attacking the vulnerable exactly as he had done 2 decades prior. A cold dread settled in her stomach as she remembered her mother's forced relocation, the developer who had used shell corporations and bogus reports to seize land intended for community housing. She ran a quick, panicked cross-reference on her private terminal before locking Julian's laptop away in a secure vault. The Shell Corporation listed on the Rosie's Kitchen condemnation order, Ethelred Acquisitions, shared key legal partners and a specific offshore holding pattern with the corporation that had ruined her father. Julian Cross hadn't just watched Richard's father collapse. He had been an active participant in the predatory practices that crushed Elena's own family. This was not just corporate warfare. It was deeply, violently personal. Adrenaline surged, clearing her mind. She snatched her coat, leaving the quiet corporate sanctuary behind. She would not wait for Richard's permission. She would not wait for the lawyers. High above the city, in the sterile, windowless war room of Ashford Technologies, Richard Ashford was attempting to hold his world together with sheer force of will. The air was thick with panic. The board's primary defense lawyer, an expensive man named Mr. Harrington, was sweating through his bespoke suit. "We have to focus, Richard," Harrington urged, pointing at a complex flow chart detailing the hostile takeover structure. "The Phoenix Group is moving too fast. We need a definitive counteroffer ready for the 11 o'clock vote, or we lose strategic control entirely." Richard ran a hand across his jaw, exhaustion pulling at his features. "We match their valuation, Harrington. We cannot let them control the narrative that the Community First initiative is ballast dragging us down." "Sir, your CFI reports show a 4.5% drag on quarterly earnings. It shows an investment in sustainability," Richard roared, the sound echoing off the soundproofed walls. "It shows humanity." Just then, his executive assistant, Pamela, a woman known for her unflappable demeanor, pushed through the heavy door, her face white with fear. She held out a single red phone, the emergency line reserved for corporate disaster. "Sir, an urgent communication from East London," she whispered, her voice trembling. They are already there." Richard took the receiver, his polished calm cracking instantly. He listened for 30 agonizing seconds, the blood draining from his face as he absorbed the devastating news. Julian had not just filed papers, he had deployed assets. The demolition crews were arriving now, erecting temporary fencing around the bakery and adjoining community center. There were reports of growing civil resistance. The community members, alerted by Elena's network, were physically blocking the entrance. Julian had perfectly engineered a situation where any delay would mean failure. If Richard stayed, the Phoenix Group would succeed, seizing the company and immediately dismantling the CFI, thereby making the East London fight pointless. If he left, the board would interpret his absence as weakness, hand the company over to the hostile bidder, and Rosie's Kitchen would still fall. "They want me to choose," Richard muttered, the realization sinking in, heavy and toxic. "The company or the community?" Harrington leaned in, frantic. "Richard, The future of Ashford Technologies. 60,000 jobs. The entire infrastructure of the future depends on you being here. You cannot let a localized planning dispute distract us. Richard looked at the charts, the graphs, the staggering numbers that represented his life's work. The cold, gleaming empire built on 2 decades of compromised morality. He pictured Rosie's kitchen, the smell of fresh bread, the sound of laughter, Elena's fierce, protective eyes. He thought of the look of contempt Elena would give him if he allowed the community to be crushed, while he prioritized profit margins and stock value. He had spent 6 months proving he wasn't that man anymore. He wouldn't let Julian win by forcing him to betray his new values. With a definitive movement, Richard slammed the receiver down. "Mr. Harrington," Richard said, his voice low, steady, and terrifyingly resolved. "Prepare the counteroffer for a shareholder vote. Inform the board that I have been called away on an executive matter of paramount importance." Harrington gaped. "Sir, you cannot leave. The 11 o'clock meeting is in 20 minutes. "I am aware of the schedule," Richard replied, already shrugging into his coat. "Tell the Phoenix Group they can have the company, but only after they have defeated me physically." He strode past Pamela, issuing a final, chilling instruction. "Call my driver. Tell him to ignore all speed limits. We are going to East London." Elena's vintage black cab skidded to a halt 2 blocks from the commotion. She paid the bewildered driver and sprinted the rest of the way, the noise of heavy machinery and agitated shouting growing louder with every step. The scene was chaos. A large, garishly yellow bulldozer was parked ominously close to Rosie's kitchen's front window. Temporary chain-link fencing, tipped with razor wire, was being erected by grim-faced security contractors wearing the unmarked uniforms of a private security firm. Julian's silent army. The community had rallied. Mrs. Rosie, frail but furious, stood in front of the bulldozer's tread, arms linked with a dozen students and elderly patrons. They were singing a defiant, off-key anthem, creating a human shield. Elena pushed her way through the periphery of the crowd, spotting the site manager, a brute of a man in a hard hat, yelling into a radio, impatient to begin the destruction. "This is private property, and we have a court order." The manager bellowed into the microphone aimed at the crowd. "Stand down, or we will commence removal proceedings," a student yelled back. "You'll have to go through us first." Elena saw her chance. The site manager's back was to her, focused on the human barrier. She lunged forward, skirting the edge of the fencing, ignoring the sharp scrape of the razor wire against her sleeve. She reached the manager, her voice piercing the noise. "Stop!" she commanded, her hands bracing against his heavy protective vest. "The court order is based on fraudulent environmental reports." The manager turned, his eyes cold and uninterested. "Lady, I don't care about the paperwork. I have a directive to clear this site, and I am going to do it. You have 5 seconds to step away from the operational zone." He lifted his radio to signal the bulldozer operator. Elena ignored the threat, desperate. "Julian Cross is running this operation. He has illegally manipulated evidence." The manager smirked, a cruel, practiced expression. "Julian Cross pays well. Now, move." He shoved her hard toward the fence line. Elena stumbled but caught herself, her gaze fixed on the front door of Rosie's kitchen, where Mrs. Rosie was clinging tightly to the doorframe, bracing for impact. The demolition manager gave the final order over the radio. The large yellow machine roared to life, its engine a promise of sudden, violent destruction. The steel bucket dipped low, ready to swing. Elena knew she had only one chance to stop the immediate attack. She threw herself back toward the bulldozer, ignoring the shouts of the crowd and the blare of the security alarms. She sprinted toward the path of the approaching machine, aiming for the massive left tread, and dropped low, seizing a forgotten piece of heavy rebar protruding from a crumbling curb. Just as the demolition manager screamed a warning, and just as the steel shovel began its slow, inevitable arc toward the front facade, Elena swung the rebar with desperate, terrifying force, aiming not for the manager, but for the most vulnerable part of the massive machine, the thin, unprotected hydraulic hose controlling the bucket's movement. The rebar hit the hose with a loud, sickening thwack, and a high-pressure jet of black, oily fluid instantly erupted, spraying over the manager's face and blinding the bulldozer operator just as the machine surged forward, out of control. The bulldozer veered sharply, missing the bakery's facade by inches, but its massive bulk kept moving, hurtling uncontrollably toward the newly erected temporary security fence, and the 20 terrified people trapped between the machine and the tight brick wall of the adjoining property. Elena froze, watching in horror as the out-of-control, 10-ton piece of machinery accelerated directly toward the helpless crowd. Aero Naharason. The engine shrieked, a tortured metallic scream that tore through the air. The heavy treads of the massive bulldozer chewed up the pavement, accelerating towards the wall. 20 panicked faces were pressed tight against the brick, eyes wide with the realization that they were trapped between the unstoppable force and the immovable stone. Elena did not think. She reacted. The fear that usually simmered beneath her surface, the fear of instability, the ghost of her mother's illness, coiled and struck. She searched frantically for anything, any small failure point, any gap, any tool. Her eyes landed on the temporary electrical junction box that powered the construction lights, situated just 3 feet from the machine's path. It was a long shot, a desperate, impossible gamble. She sprinted, not toward the people, but parallel to the charging machine. Her fingers closed around a loose length of metal rebar left near the rubble pile. With a guttural cry, fueled by absolute terror and absolute defiance, she swung the rebar, connecting with the flimsy plastic shell of the junction box just as the bulldozer's blade reached the corner. Sparks erupted, a blinding, violent flash of white-hot light, followed by the immediate, absolute silence of cut power. The bulldozer, however, did not stop. It was too massive, too kinetic. The driver, realizing the controls were dead, screamed, wrenching the useless steering wheel. The machine began to list, slightly, but continued its devastating trajectory. Elena turned back just in time to see the steel bucket, a wide, flat mouth of destruction, about to consume the first 3 people huddled near the wall. "Get down!" she shrieked, throwing herself into the crowd, pushing and shoving as the first shudder of the impact vibrated through the ground. The sound was not the tearing of metal or the crushing of bone, but a sudden, violent, crunching stop. A figure, lean and strong despite his 55 years, had somehow appeared out of the wreckage and chaos. Richard Ashford, covered in dust, his bespoke suit ripped at the shoulder, was bracing himself against the front of the bulldozer. He hadn't stopped it. No man could. But he had jammed the heavy steel security gate they had been using to block the alleyway directly into the machine's treads at the precise moment the power failed, creating just enough friction and resistance to halt the 10-ton beast inches from the first person. The smell of burnt wiring and hot metal hung heavy. Richard staggered back, gasping, wiping blood from a superficial cut above his eye. Elena rushed to him, grabbing his arm. "Rick, you were supposed to be." "I know where I was supposed to be," he said, his voice ragged but firm. "The meeting can wait." This couldn't. He looked past the wrecked machine at the faces of the community members, Rosie, the baker, weeping with relief, Father Michael offering quick blessings, the 20 people slowly standing up, miraculously unharmed. Are they safe? Yes, because of you. Richard merely nodded, retrieving his phone, which was cracked, but still functional. He stared at the time. He had wasted 30 critical minutes. The hostile takeover defense meeting had begun without him. I have to go, he stated, his face hardening, the corporate mask snapping back into place. But this time, it was reinforced by the grit of East London dust. You stay here, secure the site, collect everything you can about that environmental report. Get photos, get statements, get the name of the corrupt inspector Julian hired. Bring it to the city. Now. He turned, leaving the scene of wreckage, sprinting toward the waiting black car, driven by a panicked driver who had watched the entire demolition attempt from a safe distance. The boardroom of Ashford Technologies was a masterpiece of intimidating minimalism. Smoked glass, polished steel, and a table built for confrontation. Above it all, a massive screen displayed the plummeting stock price of the company, a blood-red ticker signaling disaster. Julian Cross sat across the table, smug and triumphant, flanked by two corporate lawyers and the leader of the Phoenix Group, a sharp-faced, silver-haired man named Mr. Vane, whose eyes held the cold emptiness of pure profit motivation. Richard's board of directors, looking pale and nervous, were spread around the table, their fear palpable. Richard burst into the room 35 minutes late, his appearance shocking, dusty, bloody, and visibly strained. "My apologies," Richard said, walking straight to the head of the table. He ignored Julian and focused on the board. "There was an incident at the Community First Initiative site. We faced a physical attack." Mr. Vane leaned forward, a viper's smile playing on his lips. "A convenient distraction, Mr. Ashford. While you were playing security guard for a failing bakery, we were discussing the reality of your company." Julian chuckled, adjusting his tie. "No more delaying, Richard. Let's get to the core issue. The board has already seen the quarterly report showing CFI as a drain. A 6-month, 7-figure, ethically driven failure. The market agrees. The share price tells the story." Richard sat down, taking a slow, deep breath, regaining the focus of the 55-year-old CEO who had built this empire, even if he regretted how he had built it. "You've prepared well, Julian," Richard conceded, staring directly at his former friend. "You used my own tools against me. The desire for profit, the fear of instability." "I used the truth," Julian retorted, slamming a sheaf of encrypted files onto the table. "And the truth is, your foundation is rotten. You claim redemption, Richard. But 20 years ago, when we started this company, you stole the core IP, covered up illegal anti-competitive practices that bankrupted your competitors, including your father's old rivals, and then silenced everyone who knew. I have the complete archive. The data proving the acquisition of TechBridge was fraudulent. I archived it before you fired me, Richard. Every email, every ledger entry, every illicit payment to the regulatory body. If this data goes public, you don't just lose the company. You go to prison for a very long time." A collective gasp went around the table. Richard's board members exchanged horrified glances. Mr. Vane's smile widened. He knew he had won. This was not a hostile takeover. It was a blackmail operation disguised as a financial maneuver. Richard closed his eyes for a brief moment, the immense weight of 30 years of guilt settling on his chest. He looked at the anxious faces of the board, the same faces that had relied on his ruthless efficiency for decades. He saw Julian, the embodiment of vengeful envy. "Julian is correct," Richard said, his voice ringing clearly in the sudden silence. 20 years ago, I made choices driven by fear, guilt, and the desire for unassailable success. I covered up the truth about TechBridge. I engaged in illegal practices. I built Ashford Technologies on a foundation of moral compromise. The confession hit the room like a physical shockwave. Julian's jaw dropped. This wasn't the denial he had anticipated. But what Julian fails to mention, Richard continued, leaning across the table, his eyes burning with conviction, is why he has this data now, and why he's partnering with the Phoenix Group. It's not about shareholder value, it's about destruction. It's about revenge. Richard pressed the remote, and the screen displaying the falling stock immediately switched to an architectural rendering of Rosie's kitchen. Julian is presenting my 20-year-old crime to obscure his current, far more malicious crime, Richard declared. He orchestrated the attempted demolition of the Community First initiative today, not just as a financial strike, but as a personal attack against the community I've sworn to protect. He falsified environmental reports using a corrupt municipal inspector he paid off. He nearly killed 20 innocent people this morning. Lies! Julian roared, springing out of his seat. Deflection! Richard is trying to pivot from his criminal past. Am I? Richard challenged, ignoring Julian's outburst. Julian, why are you so interested in Rosie's kitchen? Is it perhaps because the Shell Corporation you helped run 20 years ago was the original developer that ruined Elena Petrova's father? You didn't just hate me, you hated the whole idea of community prosperity. You want to destroy the foundations of ethical business because you never understood the difference between value and worth. The boardroom descended into chaos. Julian was yelling accusations, Mr. Vane was signaling his lawyers, and the board members were demanding clarity, realizing that both CEO and COO had deep, fundamental legal liabilities. Richard stood, towering over the table. You have a choice, gentlemen. You can sell to the Phoenix Group and take the temporary windfall, placing your faith in a man who built a company on fraud 20 years ago, which I confess is true, or you can place your faith in the man who spent the last 6 months trying to right that ship, who chose human lives over the corporate defense meeting, and who is now exposing a coordinated attack based on fraud, personal malice, and attempted manslaughter. Where is your proof of the environmental fraud, Richard? Mr. Vane sneered, his composure returning. Confession is not evidence. Richard knew he had nothing concrete in the room. He had rushed from the crisis. He had only Elena's promise. Just then, the heavy oak doors of the boardroom burst open. Elena Petrov, breathless, her hair slightly disheveled, her jacket dust-streaked, stood in the doorway. In her hands, she clutched a thick, folded manila envelope and a camera that was still displaying a recent photo of the corrupt city inspector signing a confession under police supervision, standing next to the wreckage of the bulldozer. The evidence is here, Elena announced, stepping into the room. Proof of the falsified reports, photographs of the structural damage Julian Cross ordered, and a signed statement from the inspector he bribed. She placed the envelope and camera on the table, sliding them toward the chairman of the board. You are not being blackmailed by a former partner, gentlemen. You are facing a corporate terrorist attack, fueled by vengeance and illegal environmental maneuvers. Julian looked from Richard's defiant face to Elena's determined eyes, his meticulously planned revenge crumbling around him. The 20-year-old threat was now balanced by a current, immediate criminal charge. The chairman of the board, a dour man named Sir Geoffrey, picked up the envelope, his fingers trembling slightly. He had 2 crimes on his hands, 2 deeply compromised executives. The future of Ashford Technologies hinged on which crisis was more damaging, and which man was now more trustworthy. Sir Geoffrey looked up, scanning the faces in the room, his gaze resting finally on Richard Ashford, a man who had confessed to past crimes in a desperate bid to save his future. Mr. Vane, Julian, Richard, Miss Petrova, Sir Geoffrey said, his voice thin but commanding. The board must now vote on whether to accept the buyout offer from the Phoenix Group or whether to reject it and retain Ashford Technologies under a new, immediate internal review. The silence that followed was suffocating, punctuated only by the furious breathing of Julian Cross. The market was watching. The law was watching. Richard's future, Elena's mission, and the lives of the community members hung on this single, terrifying moment of choice. Sir Geoffrey cleared his throat and addressed the first board member. "Mr. Davies, your vote, please." Mr. Davies swallowed hard, looking from the damning financial report to the evidence of attempted destruction, trying to calculate the least damaging path to survival. He opened his mouth to speak. Mr. Davies swallowed hard, looking from the damning financial report to the evidence of attempted destruction, trying to calculate the least damaging path to survival. The air conditioning hummed, a pitiful counterpoint to the roaring silence that had settled over the boardroom. Richard, his hand resting on the stack of documents Elena had provided, the time-stamped photos of the falsified environmental reports, the communication logs proving Julian's collusion with the city inspector, felt every year of his 55 years pressing down on his chest. His heart hammered a desperate rhythm against his ribs. He had traded his reputation for Rosie's kitchen, and now the cost was about to be tallied. "Mr. Davies," Sir Geoffrey repeated, his voice brittle with impatience, knowing his carefully constructed corporate facade was crumbling around him. Davies visibly shook off the paralysis of fear and uncertainty. He didn't look at Richard, Julian, or even the chairman. He looked at the window, where the cold, efficient towers of the city stared back, demanding logic. "I vote to reject the bid," Davies choked out, the words tasting like ash. "And I vote to immediately suspend Mr. Cross from all remaining duties pending a full internal investigation." A wave of assent, swift and terrified, washed across the table. Mr. Davies's logic, born of survival, became the board's immediate consensus. One by one, the directors voted against the merger, against Julian Cross. The hostile takeover attempt by the Phoenix Group was defeated. Sir Geoffrey, the lead raider, stood up slowly, a predatory smile fixed on his face that didn't reach his cold eyes. He made a slight, mocking bow toward the table. "A disappointing outcome for shareholders, gentlemen," he stated, his voice silky smooth. "But rest assured, Richard, the market demands transparency. You have bought your company back, but you have paid a staggering price for it." He nodded to Julian. "We will be in touch, Mr. Cross." Julian, white-knuckled and vibrating with thwarted rage, didn't respond. He simply gathered his leather portfolio, his eyes locked on Richard's. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of defeat, only a promise of unending future venom. He exited the room without a backward glance, leaving the stench of failure and unresolved malice hanging in the air. The board, now freed from the immediate threat of the Phoenix Group's corporate dismantling, immediately turned their full, devastating attention to Richard. The victory was momentary. The systemic damage was permanent. "Richard," began Mrs. Peterson, the financial director, her voice trembling, "you voluntarily disclosed evidence of market manipulation and anti-competitive practices dating back 20 years. While that action saved the company from Julian, it is now public record." She gestured to a small, panicked aide who slid a live market readout across the highly polished table. The display was a violent crimson smear. "Ashford Technologies' shares have been halted," Mrs. Peterson whispered, her composure dissolving. "We are reporting an immediate loss of £750 million in value. The newswire is already running stories on the alleged fraud. We face imminent regulatory investigation and likely criminal charges against the former CEO." The sheer magnitude of the financial collapse was a physical blow. Richard felt the blood drain from his face, leaving him cold and empty. He had won the war for his soul, but he had decimated the empire in the process. Eleanor reached out, her hand resting momentarily on his arm, a silent anchor in the whirlwind of corporate collapse. She saw the profound exhaustion in his eyes, not the guilt he usually carried, but the sheer cost of finally choosing truth over self-preservation. "I accept the consequences," Richard stated, his voice clear, though barely audible. He looked at the board, not with defiance, but with resignation. "I will not drag this company through a legal battle based on my own past mistakes. I took a risk on transparency to save the CFI and the community we serve, and I accept the fallout." He laid out the path forward with brutal clarity, a final act of leadership and sacrifice. "The government inquiry will be launched within the next 48 hours. To protect the company's ongoing operations, I must step down temporarily, effective immediately. I will assume the role of Chairman Emeritus, focused solely on managing the inquiry and legal defense." A heavy, painful silence ensued. The directors exchanged worried glances. The question of succession hung heavy, thick as London fog. Who could navigate this immediate crisis and protect the core ethical foundation Richard had fought for? Richard turned to Elena, his gaze unwavering, acknowledging the 28-year-old woman who had anchored his desperate redemption. "The Community First initiative is not only saved, it is the only division currently holding any public trust. Its success is essential to the survival of the company's reputation," Richard announced. He looked at the board members, challenging them to object. "Therefore, pending my return, I am handing full executive control of the company's internal operations, specifically restructuring the company to a triple bottom-line model, to Elena Petrova." Elena stared at him, stunned. The weight of managing a collapsing, multi-billion-pound entity crashed down on her shoulders, dwarfing the fear she had felt defending Rosie's kitchen. She was no longer just protecting a building. She was the temporary operational CEO of a global firm teetering on the edge of insolvency and systemic scandal. Her desire for stability had been granted in the most volatile, terrifying way possible. The board, recognizing the political necessity of placing a clean, ethical figurehead at the helm, offered only reluctant, resigned assent. Richard stood, feeling a strange lightness in his body, as if a lifetime of deceit had finally been purged, replaced by the immediate, overwhelming physical fatigue of battle. He leaned down slightly, meeting Elena's frightened but determined gaze. "The keys are yours, Elena. Don't let them reverse the course we set," he murmured. As Richard Ashford walked out of the boardroom, leaving the ruins of his former life behind to face the waiting media and the impending investigation, the only thing that mattered was the realization that he was walking toward freedom, even if that freedom was paved with shame. He had lost everything material: his reputation, his immediate control, billions in wealth, but he had gained an undeniable, priceless peace. Elena watched the doors close behind him. The adrenaline that had propelled her through the crisis began to fade, replaced by a cold dread. She was alone in a room full of suits who viewed her as a temporary necessity, and outside, the stock market roared its displeasure, a storm she was now solely responsible for navigating. Her mother's financial security was no longer a personal worry. It was intertwined with the fate of every employee of Ashford Technologies. The price of integrity, she realized, was never cheap. It was paid in sacrifice, and Richard had just made the ultimate down payment. She felt the heavy silence of the room press in. She had to address the board, to start the impossible job of rebuilding. She opened her mouth to speak, but the urgent, insistent ringing of her secured mobile phone cut her off. It was a restricted number. Elena answered, expecting legal counsel. Instead, she heard a voice, muffled and panicked, speaking rapidly over the sound of machinery. "Elena, it's Omar from Rosie's kitchen. The crews didn't stop. They're already back, and they brought police with them. They're using the court order, claiming the temporary injunction expired when the Phoenix Group withdrew. They're tearing down the South Wall right now. The city was a wound slowly closing. The panic call from Omar 1 year prior had sent shockwaves through the already decimated legal team. Richard, pale but resolute, had given Elena one single decisive instruction before walking into the waiting government inquiry meeting. Save the kitchen, whatever the cost. Elena, armed with the board's temporary, fragile faith, leveraged every asset Ashford Technologies possessed. The legal battle to halt the malicious demolition of Rosie's kitchen had been brutal, requiring all-night injunctions and the deployment of 300 security personnel. They had saved the structure, but the fight drained the company's capital and Elena's reserves of strength. While the stock plunged to its lowest point in 20 years, forcing Richard into a televised public apology regarding the anti-competitive practices of decades past, Elena stepped into the cavernous CEO office. She was 29, officially the operational chief executive officer, tasked with navigating the fallout of a corporate earthquake caused by a man seeking moral cleansing. For 6 grueling months, Richard's life was an endless loop of cross-examinations, legal discovery, and public scrutiny. He had made a pact with himself. Total, unvarnished honesty. He exposed the dark corners of the company he had built, providing the necessary documentation to sell off the morally compromised sectors, the aggressive surveillance technologies, and the automated, ethically dubious data mining divisions. He sacrificed the massive short-term revenue streams they represented, demonstrating definitively that the success he sought now was measured by human impact, not shareholder dividends. When the dust settled, Richard Ashford was financially solvent, legally free, but professionally crucified. The inquiry ruled his actions 2 decades ago were criminal, but that his full cooperation and subsequent massive restructuring proved his commitment to ethical remediation, resulting in a crippling fine rather than a prison sentence. He immediately announced his permanent step-down as CEO. The world expected Ashford Technologies to collapse. Instead, Elena Petrova rose. 1 year later, the city of London was quiet beneath a mid-afternoon sun, but the silence was one of confidence, not collapse. Ashford Technologies had stabilized, not through ruthless cost-cutting, but through rebranding the entire enterprise around the Community First initiative. Elena, using Richard's ethical framework as her strategic blueprint, demonstrated that high-impact social projects generated fierce consumer loyalty and attracted the best talent. The CFI was no longer a division. It was the company's mission statement. Elena, now Chief Executive Officer without the acting modifier, stood on the roof terrace of the newly renovated Ashford Tower. Below, the new logo, a simple, strong oak leaf, stood proudly against the gleaming glass. Her mobile phone vibrated with a quarterly report. CFI had expanded to 6 new countries, securing stable, ongoing revenue streams 500% higher than projected. Richard's sacrifice, she knew, had paid for this integrity. She took the lift down 20 floors to a smaller, quieter office, the Chairman Emeritus suite. The room was sparse, deliberately non-executive. Richard Ashford, looking fitter, calmer, and older than she had ever seen him, sat by the window. He was dressed not in a bespoke 3-piece suit, but in a comfortable cashmere sweater, reading a hard-copy newspaper rather than a digital tablet. The relentless drive that had made him a billionaire was gone, replaced by a quiet, deep satisfaction. "Elena," he said, looking up, his voice warm, not weighted. "That news report on your successful rollout in Seoul is making the front page of the Financial Times. Your stock is finally back up to 3/4 of what Julian tried to destroy." Elena smiled, leaning against the door frame. "We proved the model works, Richard. We proved that systemic kindness is not financially suicidal." We proved them all wrong. You proved them wrong, he corrected gently. I just cleared the foundations so you could build something solid. She walked toward the window, looking out over the panoramic view of the city. Her gaze wasn't on the corporate towers, but east, toward the less polished horizon where Rosie's kitchen now stood, fully repaired and expanded into a full community center, managed by Omar and a thriving staff. That environmental report Julian fabricated, she recalled, the memory still bitter. It felt like the darkest moment, that he would attack the very place where we learned to trust each other. Richard nodded, folding his paper neatly. Julian never understood that you can't manage human systems with profit-loss reports alone. His mistake was viewing people and their decency as a variable to be controlled rather than the core capital. He paused, looking directly at her, his eyes clear. You know, I achieved everything I ever thought I wanted by the time I was 40. Wealth, power, reputation, it was all smoke. It took 30 years of moral compromise and one spectacular public breakdown to find out what I actually needed. And what was that? She whispered, knowing the answer, but needing to hear it from him. Richard stood, walking over to a small, unassuming bookshelf. He picked up a chipped, cheap ceramic mug, one that had survived the near demolition of Rosie's kitchen. Contentment, he said, turning the mug in his hands. A cheap, priceless thing. I used to chase legacy. Now I just appreciate stability. The kind of stability you fought for your mother, and the kind of stability we managed to secure for that small corner of East London. He placed the mug back down. Their partnership, forged in the heat of his redemption and her unwavering moral compass, had evolved into a bond that transcended mere business. A profound, respectful connection built on shared trauma and mutual creation. So, Chairman Emeritus Ashford, Elena said, a hint of professional formality mixing with genuine affection. You have your contentment. What's next? Richard walked past the massive mahogany desk, heading toward the private exit that led to the city streets. I've resigned the chairmanship, he informed her. The transition is complete. I handled the government inquiry, restructured the assets, and established the ethical mandate. Ashford Technologies is now truly yours, Elena, built on a foundation of truth, not cover-ups. She stared at him, surprised. You're leaving London? Richard smiled, the kind of genuine, relaxed smile that reached his eyes. No, I'm just giving up the office with the high rent. I intend to stay right here, in East London, volunteering with Omar and the team. Maybe I'll handle the morning delivery logistics. I hear the kitchen needs a reliable source for organic eggs. He stopped at the door, catching her eye. I think, Richard Ashford concluded, the weight of 30 years finally lifted, that my entire global movement started with an order for 2 eggs. And that's exactly where I need to stay grounded. Elena watched him go, feeling the quiet power of the empty office. The city still glinted outside, beckoning with its endless hunger for profit. But she held the reins of a new empire, one built not on greed, but on the radical idea that kindness, meticulously applied and fiercely defended, was the ultimate source of wealth. She was the chief executive officer of the future. She turned back toward the glass, ready to face the world Richard had made safe for her to conquer, her heart full of the complicated, quiet peace that comes after a war well fought.